He thought she wanted his blanket, but what she really needed was his steadiness, the kind that keeps a roof from giving when the wind leans hard. The wind came in torn bursts, like ropes pulled tight across the sky. The night was dry and needled the lungs. Snow drifted sideways, not in soft flakes but in grit that stung the face and rattled on the cabin wall. The stove held a low red belly and no more. He sat with his back to the logs, cup cold in his hand, hat brimmed down, boots planted. The rifle lay along the bench within an easy reach he had practiced so long he no longer thought about it. The knock was not timid. 3 quick raps, then a pause, then one more, smaller, like whoever stood there had run out of strength. He lifted the bar, braced his shoulder, and the door gave inward with the night pinned to it. She stood there framed by dark and driven snow. Not a girl, a woman the weather had pared to the bone. Hair tangled and stuck to one cheek. A borrowed coat too thin at the seams. The dress beneath had lost its color to dust. The rope marks at her wrists were not old. Bare ankles, cracked and crusted, told their own road. She kept one hand tucked inside the coat and the other on the door jamb, as if the house might tip without her. He did not ask a name. Names can be stolen and sold. He stepped aside and let the warmth draw her in by inches. When he shut the door, the cabin settled with a long, wood-breathed sigh. He put a kettle on the iron ring and fed the fire with 2 split sticks and one that had waited a week for need. He unhooked the wool blanket from the peg and set it on the chair between them. He did not hold it out like an offer that requires an answer. He set it down as a fact and stepped back until the stove heat touched his knees again. She took the blanket slow, palms flat, as if it might erupt if handled wrong. She wrapped it around her shoulders and sank to a crouch near the stove, not claiming the chair, not asking. Steam began to mutter in the kettle. She watched the lid quiver and did not blink. "Coffee," he said. The word came out low from disuse. She nodded once, eyes on the metal ring, breath counting. He poured the thin brew into a tin cup, set it on the floor near her hand. She reached without looking at him, lifted it with both palms, and took small, careful sips that meant she had learned not to spill around men who made spillage into a lesson. When she finished, she set the cup where he had put it, handle turned the same way. "Hungry?" Another small nod. He broke bread that had gone hard and a wedge of cheese that had not. He placed them on a plate and slid it across the floorboards. She ate without sound, slow enough to keep from choking, fast enough to be honest about need. The cabin held to silence. Outside, the wind pushed its shoulder into the north wall and grumbled when nothing moved. He watched her gloves of rope-shadowed skin, the way her breath steadied once the stove heat found her bones. He noticed the small bulge under the coat near her ribs, where a knife might ride. Good. A person who will not defend herself has already left. When she was done, he took the plate and cup and rinsed them with a dipper from the bucket. He hung the wet cup on the peg by the door, where it would drip on the rag nailed there for that purpose. She tracked the motion. She was memorizing the house the way people memorize exits. He dragged the second chair 2 feet nearer the stove and sat, not facing her, angled so he could see the door and the window, and her without turning his head much. Habit, yes, but courtesy also. A direct stare can bind a person worse than rope. "Road?" he asked after the quiet had grown roots. She lifted her chin toward the west. Her mouth moved like the word hurt. 2 days, she said. The voice was rough-sanded. "Maybe 3. No count after the water." He nodded. The creek that braided the flats would have iced at the edges and run black in the middle. Stumbling through it in the dark would take whatever a person had left and charge interest. "Stay by the fire," he said. "Boots later." She looked down at her bare feet and then at him. Not shame, calculation, and the faintest wash of relief that anger did not arrive on cue. She tucked her legs under the blanket and held them there the way a mother might hold a child who will not stop shivering. The kettle rattled again. He poured water into a second cup, swirled in the grounds, and drank the grit with the heat. The taste of iron and ash unknotted a part of him that had been tight since afternoon. He studied the scar on the table where a brand had burned it long ago. He remembered a different winter, a different door, a different pair of eyes. The stove clicked as the iron expanded. The room breathed. She dozed in fits, the kind of half-sleep that starts in the shoulders and never reaches the jaw. When the wood snapped, her hands tightened. When the wind leaned, her head jerked and then stilled. He threw a glance at the window. Snow etched itself along the sash in delicate, merciless lace. Sometime toward midnight, she pulled the blanket higher, and the collar of the coat slid down. A dark bloom of bruising showed along the line of her collarbone, old yellow under newer purple. He did not look away fast. He allowed his jaw to set and then soften. He got up, crossed to the shelf, and took down a small crock. Tallow, willow bark, a thumb of pine resin. The salve smelled like the inside of a good tree. He set it near her and stepped back. She eyed it, then him, and then the salve again. After a long breath, she opened the lid and pressed 2 fingers to the cool paste. She worked it into her wrists first, small circles that eased the angry ridges where rope had taught its lesson. Then she lifted the blanket edge and touched the bruise with as much kindness as a person can give to herself. "Thanks," and she said, a word used like a tool, not a bow. He tipped his head. That was enough. The stove fell to a steady hum. He rose, spread the last of the coals with the poker, set 2 more sticks so they would catch without fuss, and then leaned the rifle where his hand would find it before his feet did. He unrolled a second blanket on the floor between the stove and the door and lay down with his coat for a pillow. He could have taken the bed. He could have offered it. He did neither. Offers can trap. Beds remember. "Sleep," he said into the ceiling. Her reply was the sound of breath evening out. He noticed she did not turn her back to him. He answered with stillness, the kind that says nothing will happen if you do not choose it. He drifted for an hour and then surfaced. The wind had changed pitch. Snow now came in soft, hissed sheets. The cabin took the weight without complaint. He counted the heartbeats it took to reach from floor to door. He counted the breaths it took to hear the mules shift in the lean-to. Counting keeps a man gentler than drink ever did. Before dawn, he rose and eased the bar, stepped into the gray that happens before light chooses a color. The cold bit the inside of his nose, a boy's memory. He checked the lashings on the lean-to and the loop on the gate. The sky offered nothing but a pale promise. When he returned, she had not moved much. The blanket had slipped from one shoulder again. He set it right without touching her. A man can do that with care. He ground fresh beans he kept for weather like this. The stove sang as water thought about boiling. The room began to smell like mornings that do not kill. She woke to it. Her eyes found the door first, then him, then the cup he set by the leg of the chair. She took it and held it close. Heat is a kind of mercy. "Work," he said, after she had eaten a heel of new bread he had saved in a tin. "If you're staying?" A pause. The word "stay" did not stick in her throat. "I can work," she said. He handed her a bundle of torn canvas and a bone needle, set a coil of twine beside it. He pointed with his chin to the peg where a boot hung by a broken loop. She understood. Sat. Began to stitch the way people stitch when they have repaired things that others broke, just to see if anyone cared enough to fix them. The needle flashed, thread worked, edges found each other and held. He felt the strange pull in the chest that men mistake for pain when it is only a wall giving ground. He split kindling on the block outside and brought in 4 armloads. The wood hissed where snow clung, then crackled as it dried. By noon, the room held steady warmth, a low, good kind. She had mended the loop and 2 seams on the boot. She had re-hemmed the coat that did not fit her. She had tied her hair back with twine and did not look at the door as much. He boiled a pot of beans with a strip of salt pork that had outlived better days. She found onions he had forgotten in a sack, peeled and chopped them fine, and slid them into the pot without asking. The smell changed. The house remembered it was a home when someone tends the small things. They ate at the table. He took the bench. She took the chair nearest the stove. The space between them said enough. She lifted the spoon in small arcs, blew once, tasted, paused as if listening, then ate again. He chewed and watched the snow carry its own weight past the window. When the bowls were empty, she rose and took them to the bucket. She rinsed them careful, set them on the rag, and turned the handles to face the same way he had the night before. She was telling the house she had seen it. He brought a shallow tin to the table and laid out 3 things: a short scrap of leather, a nail, and a piece of charcoal. He wrote 1 word on the leather in neat, slow strokes, and then rubbed it away with his thumb. He set the nail in the center and tapped it once with the heel of his hand, just enough to dent. He slid the leather to the side and tucked the nail back in the tin. Her eyes followed the motion. Not curiosity, recognition. She had seen men name things and claim them with iron before. She had learned to fear that sound. He left the leather blank and placed it on the mantel beside the small jar of buttons and the photograph of a woman holding a baby whose face had never learned to smile. The frame was chipped, the glass long gone. He adjusted it one finger's width and then left it to its angle. Afternoon thinned. The wind's edge dulled. He pulled on the patched boot she had mended and felt the loop hold when he hooked a finger through it. He said nothing. She pretended not to see the almost smile that cut his cheek a fraction. Near dusk, the mules stamped and blew. He opened the door and the cold bellowed once at his chest. A shape moved along the fence line. A rider slowed by snow, or a fence post bent wrong by weight. He stood until his eyes knew the difference, and then shut the door, set the bar, and slid the rocker a handspan so it would catch a boot if someone barged where they had no right. She watched the movement and nodded, a small dip that said she had made the same math before in different rooms with worse walls. When darkness took the yard, he brought out a little box from the high shelf. Inside lay a handful of things that do not look like much: a coin with a hole, a button from a blue coat, a stub of pencil, a ribbon the wind had brought to the fence and left on a knot the spring before. He placed the pencil on the table and pushed the box back where it lived. He sat and sharpened the pencil with his pocket knife until it had a point the length of a thumbnail. He laid it beside the blank leather on the mantel and did not touch it again. She reached for the salve without looking at him and worked it into the rope marks until the red calmed. She brushed a curl behind her ear. The cabin made the kind of quiet that comes only when three things are true at once. Bellies have been filled enough, the weather cannot be bargained with, and no one in the room is trying to win. When she finally spoke, it was not a story. Stories ask for payment. It was a piece of weather, delivered plain. "West Road took my shoes," she said. "The man with the rope took the rest." He waited. "I kept walking." He nodded slow. "You're here." She looked at the stove, then at the leather blank on the mantel, then at him. "For now." "For now," he said. The fire settled low. He rose and banked it with ash so the coals would live to morning. He rolled his blanket near the door again and lay down. She took the chair, folded into it with the wool around her shoulders like a winter bird around itself. She did not ask for the bed. She did not ask for anything. "Sleep," he said. She let out a breath that might have been a laugh in another life and closed her eyes. Outside, the wind learned a softer hand. Snow drew its white across the yard and smoothed over the tracks of whatever had tried to come there before. Inside, the stove ticked. The leather waited. The pencil waited. The house held three beats: his, hers, and the old one that lives in wood that has seen both hunger and mercy. He thought she wanted his blanket. That would have been easy. What she reached for, slow and without asking, was the one thing a man cannot hang on a peg. The part that stands when storms lean. The part that says stay without ever saying the word. The notice in his coat burned like a coal, but he said nothing. Some truths wait for their own hour. Until then, a man can keep his hands busy and his mouth shut. The wind had dropped, but the air stayed sharp enough to bite. Morning light showed a pale stripe on the floorboards. He laid another log into the stove, watched it catch, and set the coffee to boil. She rose from the cot behind the canvas with her blanket folded, corners neat, and hair tied back with twine. She moved like someone trying to prove she was not a burden. He poured coffee into 2 cups, left one on the table. She came forward slow, lifted it with both hands and drank without looking at him. Her wrists looked cleaner now, the swelling eased by salve and sleep. She set the cup down where it had been, handle turned exact. Boots waited by the door, patched where she had stitched them. He pointed with his chin. "Yours now." She slid them on, flexed her toes, and the leather held. She nodded once. By mid-morning they worked. He hauled wire for the south fence. She swept the floor, rinsed mugs, and patched a coat cuff without being asked. When he returned, his boots tracked mud across the boards. She wiped it up without comment. He saw her shoulders ease when the room looked whole again. At noon he hitched the wagon. Flour was near gone, lamp oil thin in the jar, and winter had not yet shown its worst. He lifted his coat and met her eyes. A question passed between them without words. She stepped into the patched boots, pulled the blanket around her shoulders, and climbed onto the wagon seat. The road into town lay hard and rutted. Snow turned to dust at every hoof strike. He drove with one hand, the other near the reins where they crossed. She sat still, eyes counting fence posts. At the cottonwoods, a hawk watched from a post and let them pass. The store smelled of dust and tobacco. The keeper looked up, nodded at him, and then at her. He asked for flour, salt, coffee, and lamp oil. He added a bolt of calico cloth, a packet of needles, and a tin of blue thread. The keeper wrote it down without asking questions. That was kindness enough. She stood near the barrel of beans, quiet, eyes on the floorboards. He saw her glance once at the calico. A breath moved across her face, not quite a smile, but close. At the door, a nailed notice rattled in the wind. He didn't look at first, but she did. The drawing was crude. The words worse. Property, desertion, a price big enough to tempt men with nothing but hunger. The face was hers or near enough. She froze. He reached up, tore it free, folded it once, twice, until the paper made no sound. He slid it into his coat and walked on. She followed. Neither spoke. On the wagon ride back, he passed her a small parcel wrapped in paper. She opened it slow, found a ribbon the color of creek water. She closed it again, held it in her hand like something fragile. She did not tie it in her hair. Not yet. At home, he stacked the flour, set the oil on the shelf, and left the calico on the table. She lit the lamp, unwrapped the ribbon, and slid it under her braid. The blue cut through the gray of her dress like a river through dust. Evening came. Bread baked soft in the stove's mouth. Beans simmered with onion. They ate at the table. He filled both cups even, set them side by side. She turned the spoon in her hand but did not eat until he had. Small habits said more than words. Later he took a strip of leather from the mantel, laid it flat, and set a pencil beside it. He pressed one line, rubbed it away, and left it blank. She watched from her chair, eyes steady. She did not reach for the pencil. He left it there and went to split wood. Night closed in. He took the chair by the door, rifle across his knees. She drew the screen closer, lay on the cot with the blanket tight, ribbons shining in the lamplight. The stove ticked. The wind went soft against the boards. Before sleep, she whispered into the dark, almost to herself. I had a name. It broke. He looked at the stove, not at her. His voice was flat, steady. This house can hold another. Silence answered. A silence that did not wound. The paper stayed hidden behind the mantelboard, but the world has ways of reading what a house tries to forget. The storm broke at dawn and left the pasture flat as a page. He stepped out to read it. Coyote at the far fence. A rabbit that changed its mind twice. One light horse skirting the cottonwoods. Small hooves. A boy's pony turning back toward town. No strangers. He breathed once, steam white in the air, and went to the pump. The handle groaned. The bucket filled clean. Inside, she had pinned the ribbon back into her hair and rolled the new calico tight on the table. A seam already basted down one edge. She had moved the broom to the corner where he always kept it, bristles up, handle tied with twine. Bread rose slow by the stove mouth under a cloth. The room felt set, not finished. Set. He mended a harness strap with a rawhide stitch. She hemmed. Quiet work, the kind that builds a day. The kettle clicked, gentle as a clock that only 3 people can hear. When she stood to fetch the water pail, he noticed she walked without guarding her feet. The boots had accepted her. She had accepted their weight. Near noon, sound came thin on the winter air. Not wind, not game. Hooves. 2. Then a third, late and harder. He lifted his eyes. She froze where she stood, hands around the pail. He reached for the rifle and set it in the place his hands knew. He did not raise it. Some weapons work just by being where they've always been. 3 riders slid into the yard and loosened the reins without tying. Their horses breathed steam and stamped. The men wore coats made for rooms, not weather. One had a hat brim too clean for fence work. Another wore a deputy's star that had seen more whiskey than law. The third let his eyes travel the house, counting windows, doors, distances. He had the look of a man who solved problems by misnaming them. The woman moved a half step behind the table. She did not run. The ribbon's blue looked fierce in the doorway's gray. The talker smiled the way men do when they practice in mirrors. "Morning," he said, bright. "We're posting notices for a gentleman south of town. Paper says you might be harboring property that walked off." The man by the door didn't look at the mantle. He didn't look at the bucket where the folded handbill dried to a curl. He looked at the fence line he had set last winter and the hinge he'd oiled the night before. "No property here," he said, voice even. "Nothing in it to grasp." The deputy touched the star as if it would explain him. "Rewards fair. Any help given, we forget small irregularities about taxes and brands." The talker leaned on the saddle horn, put his weight where the mare could feel it. "House like this needs friends," he said, looking past the man to the woman as if she were a shadow and not a person. The man stepped once, so the talker had to look at him to keep speaking. The rifle stayed on his forearm, not aimed, politely present. "Road's that way," he said, "in case you forgot." Something in the talker's face thinned. He wasn't used to silence that didn't ask permission to exist. He looked to the deputy for law's shape. The deputy found nothing to pin a badge to and shrugged. The third rider shifted in his saddle, impatient. He let his hand drift near the loop of his holster, not touching, just reminding the day that hands can change it. The woman set the pail on the floor without a sound. It was a small thing. It told the room which way weight would fall if it had to. "Search," the talker said, as if offering a favor. "Then we all feel better." The rifle lifted a finger's width, enough for horses to notice. "No," the man said. The deputy's star looked smaller then. The impatient one spat into the snow and missed his own boot. The talker tilted his head, as if listening to a tune only he heard. He smiled again, thinner. "We'll be back," he said, bright with promise. "With paper." "Bring a judge," the man said. "Bring the town. Let them hear what word you use when you mean woman." The three looked at each other like dice that have learned their faces, then bunched their reins and turned. Hooves slogged. Steam trailed them out of the yard. They didn't hurry. They didn't take anything. They left a shape behind, though, the way a room feels after a man who never learned how to close a door. The woman stood a long moment with her hand on the back of the chair. The man set the rifle down, muzzle toward the floor, and listened for the last hoofbeat to die. He heard only the stove and her breath begin to steady. He took the folded notice from behind the mantelboard and set it flat on the table. He weighed it with the salt crock so the wind could not decide for them. The drawing looked less like her today. The numbers had not changed. She pulled the ribbon free and laid it along the paper like a line crossing through a lie. Her fingers did not shake. "They think names are traps," she said. The words were plain. No story asked for. He nodded. "Some are." She looked at the blank leather tag on the mantel, then at the pencil near it, then at the door. She lifted the pencil and tested the point against her thumb. She did not write. She set the pencil down and pressed the strip of leather flat under her palm, as if to tell it to wait one more day. They worked the afternoon to tire the part of the body that grows fear. He mended a gate chain that always argued in the wind. She cut the calico on the table and stitched long seams by lamplight, her head bent, ribbon trailing like a creek through grass. The bread baked and cooled. The house held its line. Toward dusk, he saddled the mare. "Pasture drifted thin," he said. "Need to break the crust." He looked at her and at the shovel by the door. She pulled on the coat and followed out. Snow lay crisp, brittle enough to cut. He walked ahead, stamping a path toward the eastern trough, breaking the hard top so the mule could find water without tearing its shins. She came behind with the shovel and shaved the ridges flat, leaving a narrow road from lean-to to trough, from trough to barn, from barn to door. When the mare nosed past, the animal paused and put her soft mouth against the woman's sleeve. The woman stood very still and let the world be gentle with her, once. Back inside, he warmed his hands over the stove and watched her set the loaf out of reach of mice, cover the needle with a scrap of cloth, hang the ribbon on the peg by the window, where night would find it if it came looking. He took down the little box from the high shelf and opened it. A stamp set lay inside, small punches with letters cut in iron. He held the A and the E and then set them back. He took the blank ones, the dot he used between numbers on harness tags, the small star he'd found at the bottom years ago and never used because it felt like bragging. He set these beside the leather strip and the nail. He didn't look at her when he did it. He went to the door and adjusted the rocker the way his father had when storms carried men as well as weather. The chair would catch a toe if someone barged. People who stumble start talking. Talking makes time. She came to the table and ran her thumb along the edge of the leather. They will bring paper, she said, eyes on the strip, and men who like the sound of their own spurs. He nodded. Then we put our paper first. He pressed the nail through the leather to mark the hole. He set the strip on a scrap of oak. She lifted the star punch and held it to the leather. Her hand hovered. He put his palm on the wood near hers, not touching her, close enough to steady the table if the hammer wobbled. She brought the hammer down once, square. The star sank into the strip. She brought the dot next and set it modestly to the right. Not a name yet. A promise that there would be one. She exhaled as if a tight seam had finally been pulled true. They hung the tag on the peg by the door under the two hats. The one he wore and the one that had belonged to a man the house no longer remembered. The tag swung and then stilled. The room changed, no louder than a breath. That night, snow began again. Soft, uncommitted. He banked the fire and took the chair by the door. She lay on the cot, blanket up, eyes open to the crack in the canvas. The ribbon in her hair looked darker in lamplight, blue almost black. Sometime deep, hoofbeats touched the edge of hearing and then left it. He did not rise. He counted to 100, then to 100 again. The house held. The tag hung. The stove breathed. He closed his eyes and let the minutes pass unremarked. Morning came pale and taller than the day before. He took the sled and went to the cottonwoods for deadfall. She stayed and carved buttons from bone. Small rounds she sanded against the stovestone until they were smooth. When he brought the wood, she sewed the buttons to the new dress, blue thread biting clean through cloth. She did not try it on. She folded it and put it on the shelf as if saving summer in a box. After noon, the deputy came alone. No talker, no third man with the hard eyes. The deputy's star looked heavier in the weak light. He kept his horse back at the fence and called without dismounting. "Judge says if there's no paper, there's no search," he said, hat in his hands like it was a bowl meant for something other than coins. "You'll want to go careful into town a while." He didn't ask why the man had come soft. He didn't ask whose hand had stayed the other's. He walked to the fence, leaned his forearms on the top rail, and nodded. "Understood." The deputy glanced at the door, at the ribbon in the window, at the tag under the hats. He met the woman's eyes for a breath, then looked away like a man who had not expected to see another person behind a word. He touched the brim, turned his horse, and left the way a man leaves when he is ashamed of how long it took him to say a simple thing. The woman stood in the doorway with the blanket around her shoulders, her mouth pressed into a line that was not fear. She looked at the tag, then at him. "You keep watch," she said. Not a question, a measure. He nodded. "And work." They worked until the sky took the color out of things. He planed the edge of the table where bread always snagged and tore. She stitched the hem of the new dress into a narrow, strong line that would not drink the dirt with every step. He hammered a second nail into the doorframe at shoulder height and looped a leather strap over it so the bar would fall without hands if someone pushed too fast. She filled a jar with dried onions and set it by the flour, lids facing forward like soldiers who did not need inspection. At dusk, he took the photograph from the mantel and set it on the table. The woman came and stood opposite. The glass had been gone so long the picture had taken air and smoke into itself, the way faces do. He looked at the woman in the picture, at the child whose mouth had not learned to ask. He put the frame down and set the ribbon beside it, blue bright against sepia. "She yours," the woman said, simple. He held the picture steady with 2 fingers. Was. She slid the ribbon away from the photograph and back toward the peg. "This house holds more than one story," she said. "It can hold mine without dropping hers." He breathed out, long, the way a man does when a thought he has carried too long finally sets itself down. Night came honest and early. He stoked the fire and banked it low. She took the chair for a while and let him have the cot. He did not argue. Some generosity is heavy if refused. He lay with his boots off and his coat under his head, eyes on the crack in the canvas where lamplight curled around the edge. He heard her breathing settle into the rhythm of someone who is learning a new kind of tired, the kind that comes from labor chosen, not fear spent. Just before sleep, she stood and crossed to the mantel. She lifted the leather tag, pressed it once against her palm, and hung it back. Then she took the pencil and with 3 small strokes, put a mark no one would see unless they knew where to look. A line that would be a letter someday. She set the pencil down and returned to the chair. He watched without moving. He did not ask what letter she had begun. Names, like fences, are better when they set slow and deep. Outside, the world went quiet enough to hear the ice tighten on the river. Inside, the stove whispered. The tag hung true. The house, with its scars and pegs and 2 cups, took on the patience of things that intend to last. The 4th night was the first where the wind did not test the seams. Quiet changes a house more than storms do. The snow crust had hardened to a skin that cracked under boots. He walked the perimeter with the rifle low, not looking for trouble, just reminding the ground he was still there. At the trough, he broke ice with the flat of the spade. The mule drank slow, eyes half closed. Winter had a way of teaching animals to measure time better than men. When he returned, the stove's lid clicked from heat. She had stacked the last of the chopped wood neat by the door, and the new calico dress hung across the chair back. Finished. The ribbon matched the hem. The stitches were straight. She had not asked him to look, but she left it where eyes could not miss. He set the rifle on the mantel, laid the spade against the wall, and sat at the table. The bread was cut, 2 pieces, neither bigger. She slid one toward him, her hand brushing the grain of the board as if smoothing it. They ate without words. The quiet had stopped being silence. It was now a room they both sat inside. Toward afternoon, tracks appeared at the far line. Not riders this time. A wagon, 2 mules pulling, wheels cutting deep ruts through the white. He stood in the yard, coat collar up. She came to the doorway, the ribbon already tied back in her hair, the finished dress folded over her arm. The wagon stopped short of the gate. A man climbed down. He wasn't one of the 3 who had come before. This one wore a broad coat with sheepskin lining and a hat pulled low. His beard was long, gray, but trimmed neat. In his hand he carried not a gun, but a folded paper. "Notice is posted," he said. His voice was worn smooth by use. "Judge signed it." The man at the gate did not reach for the rifle. He only said, "Judge never been this far north." "True," the stranger said, "but he signed anyway." He lifted the paper. The wind tried to take it. His hand held steady. She stepped forward then. 1 pace. Her bare hand closed around the folded dress until her knuckles went white. She said nothing. Her breath left clouds in the cold. The bearded man looked at her, then at the house, then at the tag under the hats. His eyes paused on the small star punched into leather. He drew a slow breath. "Not my quarrel," he said, "but they'll come again, with words and with guns. Best you be ready." He tucked the paper back inside his coat and turned without waiting for answer. The wagon moved on, mules blowing steam into the cold air. Inside, the woman set the dress flat on the bedroll. She smoothed the cloth with her palm. "They'll not stop," she said. He leaned against the doorframe, jaw set. "Then we don't either." She looked up at him, her eyes steady, darker than the sky outside. "This house can't fight paper." He walked to the mantel, lifted the tag, and pressed his thumb over the star. "Paper burns," he said. "Stone doesn't. Leather doesn't." He hung it back. The tag swung once, then stilled. That night they worked late. He cut new beams from the pile he'd dragged in days before, splitting and shaping them by firelight. She stitched sacks into long strips, stuffing them with dried reeds for insulation between the logs. The boy's laughter, light, sudden, rose from the corner where he stacked stones into a small wall of his own. He had begun to laugh again. When the work ended, they sat close to the fire. She held the ribbon in her hand, not in her hair, letting it trail across her lap. The boy slept, his cheek pressed to the blanket. "You still carry her picture," she said softly. He did not look up. "Always." Her fingers tightened on the ribbon. "And now you carry mine." He looked at her then, at the way the firelight caught in her eyes. He said nothing, but his hand reached out, slow, steady, and rested on the ribbon where it lay across her lap. He didn't move it, just left it there. Her breath caught, once, then eased. She set her hand over his, and for a long time, neither moved. The fire burned low. The boy breathed even. The wind shifted outside, but the walls held. By morning, the world had changed. Snow fell soft, covering the wagon tracks of the night before, erasing the lines that had pointed back toward town. The house stood alone again. She wore the new dress that day, the ribbon tied at her waist. He said nothing about it, but when he carried Wood in, he paused longer than needed at the doorway, watching her move about the room as if she had always been part of it. It was not yet safety, but it was the beginning of something the world could not take without burning itself down to do it. Paper can travel on a fast horse, but it still burns. What does not burn is what two hands build and promise to keep. The fifth morning wore a hard, bright cold. The sky was clean, the kind that makes edges truer. He walked the yard, boot soles creaking on the crust, and checked the little things that keep a house upright. Hinge pin, gate loop, the way the rocker sat to catch a careless boot. Inside, the stove held its red. She was already up, hair braided, the blue ribbon tied at the nape like a quiet flag. The calico dress fell straight. The hem held its line. She moved with that new steadiness a place gives when it starts to answer your name back. He set coffee to boil. She folded the blanket square, smoothed it with her palm, and stood for a breath at the mantel, eyes on the leather tag. The star and the tiny dot caught the early light. The pencil lay where she'd left it. She did not touch it. Not yet. By noon, the world had gone still enough to hear ice tighten on the river. That's when the sound came. Hooves, more than two. Not in a hurry, not in fear. Men who believe the ground makes way. He stepped to the yard and let his breath go slow. She stood in the doorway with the ribbon bright and her hands empty, which is sometimes braver than carrying iron. 5 riders. The talker from before, smiling like a blade. The impatient one with the twitching hand. The deputy with his star turned dull under winter light. And 2 more he didn't know, both with the look of men who hire out their ethics when the money's good. Behind them, a wagon. In its bed, a box with a lock and a folded paper weighted with a stone. Brought the law, the talker said, cheerful as a preacher. He lifted the paper. Judge signed. Town agreed. Property to be returned. His eyes jumped past the man and landed on the woman, lingered not on her dress, not on the ribbon, but on the way she didn't step back. He liked to flinch. He didn't get one. The man said nothing. He set the rifle where it always went, crook of arm, muzzle toward the dirt. He planted his boots. Silence did its work first. The deputy cleared his throat. Paper says what it says. His voice carried less than always, like it had a weight tied to it. She stepped down off the threshold, one pace, then another, until her boots set square in the yard. The blue ribbon caught a seam of sun. She looked at the talker, then at the deputy, then at the locked box. That paper has a dead man's handwriting on it, she said plain, and a price for a life that doesn't belong to you. The talker grinned with all his teeth. Belong is a generous word. We prefer claim. Some word, the man said steady. Don't travel onto this yard. The impatient one shifted in the saddle, hand drifting near the loop. The new pair stared at the house the way coyotes study a chicken coop, hopeful but unwilling to be first through wood. The deputy kept his eyes on the ground between his horse's ears. Here's Mercy, the talker said, friendly as hail. We take her quiet, and no one keeps score. The woman lifted her chin a fraction. I'm not going. He felt the sentence seat itself in the yard like a new fence post finding rock. He didn't smile. He didn't move. He let that word root. The talker sighed, disappointed the way men are when the play doesn't follow their rehearsal. He nodded to the impatient one. Bring the paper. The man with the twitch hand swung down, boots squealing on old snow, and came forward with the folded sheet. His spurs talked to themselves. He held the paper out, palm up, like a trick. Touch it, he said. Make it tidy. The man in the yard didn't reach. She did. She took the paper, turned it once, twice, reading without looking at the letters. Then she stepped to the stove's ash bucket at the door and set the paper on its rim. She looked at the talker until he finally met her eyes. Not her mouth, not her hands. You want the truth to hold, she said. Hold it yourself. He laughed. Ma'am, I've held worse. Then hold this. She took the poker, lifted a coal from the stove mouth, and laid it in the crook of the paper. The dry edge caught, curled, darkened, bloomed. The talker's smile faltered and then died as the judge's name went black and drifted up in a small, honest smoke. No one moved. The deputy's horse stamped once and settled. You just bought yourself trouble, the impatient one said, low, hand finally landing hard on leather. Trouble was already here, the man answered. Learned our names. Gets them wrong. The talker recovered his cheer like a card from up a sleeve. You think a campfire trick ends this? He gestured with his chin to the wagon. The lock on the box flashed dull. We can write another. We can post 10. Write 50, the man said. You'll still have to cross the fence to make them mean something. Silence again. Snow whispered off a cedar limb. Somewhere down valley, a crow told a joke no one laughed at. The impatient one shifted his stance, and the talker held up 2 fingers without looking. Wait. He had the sense to count who stood on which earth. Then the deputy did the smallest brave thing a man can do. He touched his hat brim toward the woman and the man both, and turned his horse a half step away from the yard. Judge signs a lot, he said, voice dry. He ain't the one comes for what he signs. He looked at the talker then, really looked, like a man remembering how to see. I ain't either. He lifted the reins and put his horse at the head of the 5, not the tail. Road's back there. The talker's smile thinned to nothing. He did his math again and didn't like the answer. He could take a woman from a room with no name, but a house with a name fights back in ways men don't plan for. He spat into the snow. It ain't over, he said. The woman took the burned curl of paper with tongs and let it drop into the ash bucket. It is for today, she said. The riders pulled their horses around. Hooves chewed the ruts they'd made coming in. The wagon wheel found a hole and bumped. No one looked back. The quiet they left behind wasn't clean yet, but it was the kind you can breathe. He set the bar on the door without sound. She stood with her palms open, as if checking whether her hands still belonged to her. They did. The ribbon had slid loose. He reached as slow as weather and retied it, fingers careful not to brush the skin unless asked by fate. She stood very still, then nodded once, as if to say that counted. Inside, the stove ticked. The house watched them like an old friend who has decided they might be worth the keeping. He took the small box from the high shelf and set it on the table, not hiding it this time. He laid out the letter punches in a line, the ones he had not touched in years because letters can weigh more than iron. He set the leather tag beside them. The star he'd stamped shone dully. The dot waited. He didn't speak. He took his hand away. She looked at the tag, then at the door, then at him. Weather moved across her face and settled. She picked up the T first, then paused, changed her mind, and took the H. She set it to leather and looked at him as if to ask whether the house could stand it. He put his palm on the table, not her hand, steadying the wood, and nodded. She brought the hammer down. H, a breath. E, another. N. She stopped. He swallowed and did not help. Another letter, smaller, placed where only they would know to look. She set the hammer down and pressed the tag with her thumb. The new cuts darkened as the leather took air. He took the nail and drove it through, 2 sure taps, and hung the tag under the hats where Winter and men could read it if they needed to. The name wasn't just his, it was the house's now. She had put it there. He felt the odd lightness that comes when a burden shifts from one shoulder to 2. They didn't kiss. They didn't speak vows. He went out and dug the drift from the lean-to roof before it caved. She took the burned flakes from the ash bucket and scattered them in the yard where boot traffic would grind them into soil. The work of the day made sense again. Near dusk, he carried in a beam he'd cut long ago and kept against the wall because it was straight and true, and maybe for something worth doing. He set it across 2 pegs high over the stove. She watched him measure, then brought the level she'd made from a string and a penny. He smiled, small at that. They set the beam, and it sat without complaint. Why a beam? She asked, soft. Roof's sound, he said, but some winters like to test what you say you'll keep. She stood beneath it and laid both hands on the wood like a book. Then let it hold what we choose. They hung nothing on that beam that night. They didn't need to. It was enough to know where chosen things would live when storms shouted. He took the photograph down once more. He set it on the table. He put the ribbon beside it again, not to cover, not to compare, to say what the house already knew. Grief and new breath can sit at the same board if someone keeps the fire even. She touched the frame with 2 fingers, then the ribbon, then stepped away. When the first star showed, he took his chair by the door. She drew the canvas only part way, the way a person does when the room on the other side has turned from shelter into home. The tag with the new letters hung true under the hats. He listened to the river make winter's small music. He heard nothing with spurs. Sometime deep in the night, she rose and crossed the floor. Barefoot, careful, the way a life steps when it has learned to be quiet and now chooses to be. She stood over him, the ribbon a shadow on her shoulder. "You keep watch," she said. It was not a question anymore. "I do, and I stay." He didn't answer. He reached up, found her hand without looking, and set it across the back of his knuckles like a plank across a gap. She left it there a long time, then leaned down, rested her brow to his, and let the house hear the smallest word that can hold a life. Home. Morning would bring chores that ask for no hero. The stove would want wood. The fence would want a nail. The road would try once more to parade its papers. Let it. Names stamped in leather are not law, but they are promises with hands behind them. He would cut and mend and stand where standing matters. She would stitch and bake and write slow letters in a book only 3 hearts could read. Between them would hang a beam meant to hold. Above them would sit a sky that had finally learned their shape. He had thought she wanted his blanket. What she needed, what she took, and what he gave was the part of a man that keeps the door barred against winter and open for a life.